Hello and welcome to Video Podcast 2.3. This video podcast serves as a bridge between discussing igneous rocks and sedimentary rocks. And in it, we're going to talk about two different types of weathering, namely mechanical weathering and chemical weathering. In the previous video, I discussed the formation of igneous rock, and igneous rock forms through the cooling and crystallization of either magma or lava. To form extrusive igneous rock, lava must cool and crystallize, and to form intrusive igneous rock, magma must cool and crystallize. This particular video is actually going to focus on the purple arrow shown here, because in order to make sedimentary rock, we have to have sediment. Put quite simply, sediment is tiny little bits of broken down rock, and to get those tiny little pieces of broken down rock, we have to consider the mechanisms by which igneous rock can be broken down into smaller pieces. Let's start off by considering mechanical weathering. Mechanical weathering is sometimes called physical weathering, and it's the process of breaking rocks into smaller pieces. To kind of conceptualize mechanical weathering, imagine taking a brick and then grabbing a large hammer and smashing the brick into tiny little pieces. When you smash the brick, you didn't cause a chemical reaction to occur. The little bits of brick are made of the exact same stuff as the original brick. With mechanical weathering, it's nature swinging the metaphorical hammer. When we talk about mechanisms for mechanical weathering, frost wedging might be the most important to consider. Before talking about what frost wedging is, it's important that you understand a pretty important fact regarding the behavior of water. Most substances actually contract when they freeze, but water is unique. It's one of the few substances that actually expands when it freezes. And what that means is liquid water will take up a certain volume, but if that liquid water freezes, it'll want to take up a larger volume. So the take-home point here is when water freezes, it expands in volume. Frost wedging is going to be most effective in climates where there's freezing and there's thawing as the seasons change. And Illinois is actually a pretty good example of a climate just like that. So suppose liquid water fills some cracks that exist in a rock. When that water freezes, it's going to want to expand. And when it expands, it's going to widen that crack and physically break apart the rock as it pushes to expand. This image of a glass bottle that got shattered is a nice analogy for exactly what I'm talking about. You can imagine water kind of filling the inside of the bottle, and then as that water froze and expanded, it pushed out on the glass walls, and for water to freeze, it will push out to the volume that it wants to occupy to be in its frozen state. And when it does that, as illustrated in this picture, it can be a very powerful agent of mechanical weathering. So the take-home point about frost wedging is that those water-filled cracks can be enlarged if that water is to freeze and form ice. And as that water freezes, it will exert an outward pressure to physically break the rock apart. Another mechanical weathering process to consider is biological activity. For example, tree roots can extend into rock layers, and as they grow, they can enlarge fractures in rock and physically break the rock apart. In this class, when we talk about biological activity and mechanical weathering, our primary focus is going to be on tree roots and plant roots that are capable of fracturing rock layers and breaking rock. But two other examples of biological activity and weathering are burrowing animals that can expose rock, and when that rock's exposed, it's much easier to weather. And dead decaying organisms produce acidic substances as they decay, and those acids can contribute to chemical weathering. That death and decay example is kind of grim, but it's a great transition into the last thing I want to talk about in this vodcast, which is chemical weathering. With chemical weathering, we are talking about chemically changing the composition of rocks. Specifically, the original rock will be transformed into a new, stable material. Water is the most important agent of chemical weathering. As an example, oxygen dissolved in water can cause oxidation. And in the image to the right, showing that really rusty chain, the rust is an example of oxidation. The chain is made of iron, and if that chain gets wet, the iron can chemically react with oxygen dissolved in the water to form the rust that you see in this image. Another example of the important role that water plays in chemical weathering is when carbon dioxide gets dissolved in water. Carbon dioxide has the chemical formula CO2, and water has the chemical formula H2O. If carbon dioxide gets dissolved in water, we form a compound known as carbonic acid, which has a chemical formula H2CO3. Carbonic acid can be very effective in chemically weathering rocks, especially limestone. In a nutshell, the two images shown are excellent examples of why water is the most important agent of chemical weathering. Now at this point, a good question would be which rocks are susceptible to chemical weathering and which aren't. If you look at Bowen's reaction series, which was shown in the previous Vodcast, the first minerals to crystallize out are typically going to be the least stable at Earth's surface, and as you work your way from top to bottom, those minerals and rocks shown at the lower portion of Bowen's reaction series are going to be the most resistant to chemical weathering. Quartz is extremely resistant to chemical weathering, and being as quartz is one of the chief constituents of granite, it's important to realize that granite is also very resistant to chemical weathering. That's why granite's often used when constructing monuments and making tombstones. Our final consideration, and it's a very important one, is that chemical weathering is most effective in warm, wet climates. The wet climate part's probably understandable because we know that water is the most important agent of chemical weathering. So if you're in a dry region like a desert where there's not much water in its liquid form or in its vapor form in the atmosphere, which you may know as humidity, chemical weathering will be very limited. But another important consideration in chemistry, from a conceptual standpoint, is that reaction rate and temperature are proportional. So the warmer it is in a climate, the more vigorous chemical weathering will be. So ideally, if we want chemical weathering to be optimized, we want a warm, wet climate. The worst possible climate for chemical weathering would be a cold, dry climate. Okay, that concludes Video Podcast 2.3. I hope you can see the differences between mechanical weathering and chemical weathering, although it's important to state that both are extremely important when it comes to creating the sediment necessary to form sedimentary rock. In summary, mechanical weathering is the breaking of rocks into smaller pieces, and chemical weathering is reactions that take place, almost always facilitated by water, to create new products, all of which will be stable at Earth's surface. In our next video, we will overview the process of sedimentary rock formation.